All right, let's jump right in. Today we're tackling a massive question, one that gets to the very core of human history. Was our destiny, our entire path to civilization, really determined by luck? You know, the luck of having the right animals around?
I mean, really think about it. Why did massive empires with steel, guns, and complex governments pop up in some parts of the world, while people in other places lived totally different lives? For centuries, people have argued about this, but the answer might have less to do with human genius and a lot more to do with the animals we happen to share the planet with.
So, let's get into our first big idea, what some have called the domestication jackpot. The theory is that some continents, just by sheer luck of the draw, had a massive head start because of their local wildlife.
Okay, so check this out. This map is fascinating. It shows that the switch to farming wasn't some big global idea that everyone had at once. Nope. It sparked up completely on its own in just a few isolated places, like the Fertile Crescent way back around 9000 BC. And why there? Well, because those were the only places that had the right raw materials to even get started.
You can't just decide to domesticate any old animal. It seems obvious, but you can't exactly herd grizzly bears or try to milk a zebra. Most animals are just too aggressive or too skittish, or they don't have the right social structure. Turns out, the number of species that were even possible candidates for domestication was incredibly small.
And this is where the sheer unfairness of it all just slaps you in the face. Look at these numbers. Eurasia started the game with 72 potential large mammals to work with. The Americas, only 24. And poor Australia, just 1. This was never a level playing field. It was a geographical landslide from the absolute beginning. And that one initial advantage kicked off this unbelievable domino effect. See, animals gave you a steady food surplus. That food surplus meant you could support bigger, denser populations. And once you have big populations settled in one place, not everyone has to be a farmer anymore. You get specialists, people who can become soldiers, inventors, writers, leaders. That animal advantage snowballed into a total civilizational advantage.
But hold on. What if that whole story, that whole idea of progress, is just completely wrong? What if the agricultural revolution wasn't this great leap forward for humanity, but actually, as the historian Yuval Noah Harari calls it, history's biggest fraud? Just let that sink in for a second. The idea that we didn't master plants like wheat domesticated us. It used us to spread its DNA all across the planet. We're the ones who gave up a pretty flexible lifestyle to break our backs in the fields, all to serve the needs of a single type of grass. So let's really break this down. For the average person, life as a hunter-gatherer was actually not so bad. You had a really varied diet, you probably worked fewer hours, and you were less likely to starve if one food source disappeared. Now compare that to the early farmer. You're working sunup to sundown, eating a pretty boring, unhealthy diet of mostly grain, and living crammed together in villages that were perfect breeding grounds for disease. For the individual, this so-called progress made life a whole lot harder. And this leads us to a really deep paradox. The agricultural revolution might have been a total disaster for the average individual person and animal, but from a cold, hard evolutionary point of view, it was a wild success for our species as a whole. So what's with this massive number on the screen? 25 billion. That's roughly how many chickens there are on Earth today. From a purely evolutionary perspective, which is all about making more copies of your DNA, the chicken is one of the most successful species that has ever existed, and it's all thanks to us. And this chart just drives that point home. Just look at these numbers. The population of just one domesticated species, cattle, absolutely dwarfs the combined population of all their wild mammal cousins. From a DNA standpoint, we and our domesticated partners have completely taken over the planet. But, and this is a huge but, there's a devastating catch to all this so-called success. This evolutionary victory came at the cost of unimaginable, widespread suffering. Success for the species' DNA did not mean a good life for the individual animal, not even close. I mean, for the animal itself, the reality is just awful. Their lives are cut brutally short. They're crammed into tiny spaces. Their most basic natural instincts are completely ignored. For the overwhelming majority of these successful species, domestication has been, and still is, a complete and utter catastrophe.
So, we've seen how the animal lottery could have shaped history, and we've seen the terrible cost for individuals. But there's another layer to this, another way that geography played a huge part. Let's zoom out and look at another model of how civilizations developed. All right, take a look at this map. It's a really interesting model from a Japanese ethnologist named Tadao Umasao. He saw the giant Eurasian landmass as being split into different zones. In the middle, you have this huge dry area, the home of powerful nomadic horsemen. Then, wrapped around them is a ring of huge empires like China, Russia, and India, who were always dealing with these nomads. And here's the kicker. Those big empires in the middle, they basically acted like a giant shield, absorbing constant pressure from the nomadic invasions. That meant that the places on the far, far edges, places like Western Europe and Japan, were uniquely protected. That protection, on top of the head start they got from having domesticated animals, let them develop on a totally different track.
Okay, so after all of that, after the animal lottery, the individual suffering, and the geopolitical shielding, it all brings us back to one big, difficult question. When we use the word progress, what do we actually mean? When you put it all together, the agricultural revolution starts to look less like a simple step forward and more like, well, a deal with the devil, a Faustian bargain. As a species, we gained incredible collective power, the power to build cities and empires, but that power was bought with the toil and misery of the individual farmer and the suffering of billions upon billions of animals.
And that leaves us with a really heavy question, one that we should still be asking today. When we look back at the grand story of human achievement and say the word progress, who was that progress really for? Was it for the average person? Was it for the animals whose fates we sealed? Or was it just for our DNA, for the cold, relentless drive to make more copies of ourselves, no matter the cost?